Hello, and welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to our second video, so the second half of Act 1, Scene 1 for Aristophanes the Frogs. You know? Yes, so we actually get the titular frogs in this scene for a brief amount of time. Sort of curious. Why is the play named after them if they show up for only a short amount of time? But let's first go over what actually happened in this part of the scene, and then talk about things in a little more depth. So, Dionysus does meet the frogs. He hears them start singing as he's rowing, though the stage directions note it's to a completely different beat than what he was rowing to before. So, whoops. And it turns out the frogs like singing about things like the fact that they sing, or the fact that a lot of the gods and muses come to them for their musical needs. How the revelers go home dancing to their song. It's all very nice if Dionysus wouldn't just keep interrupting, talking about how much his butt hurts from rowing. He doesn't stop interrupting. In fact, Dionysus gets to the point where he takes over the frog's song. He decides for some reason that he's going to silence them by singing instead. And ultimately actually does. The frog chorus goes quiet when Dionysus beats them at their own rhyming song. But it's also the end of the boat journey, so Dionysus needs to go anyways. He does hop off of Charon's boat and finds Zan, his slave, again, meeting back up on the other side of the river Styx. Zan seems to be doing okay because somehow, and this is another question whether or not something's actually there seems to be a noise of some sort. Dionysus freaks out and hides, begs for protection from the audience, and shits his pants. Zan seems to be doing fine, and in fact he's probably egging all of this on rather than, you know, actually helping with the situation. Ultimately, they have to hide, though, when the initiates that Hercules warned them about arrive, actually dancing and celebrating their mysteries. Now, the mysteries here, it's important to note, are meant to be only known by the initiates. You're not supposed to know any of the service, the dance, the song, anything like that, if you're not one of the initiates. So, sharing this on stage, and we actually get quite an extensive song and dance, with a traditional meal thrown in there as well. Dionysus and Zan actually eventually join the dance. Originally they were just hiding, sort of watching, but then they get right into it and go ahead and then out themselves by saying, "Hey, we're actually strangers here, can you point us towards the House of Hades?" And the chorus leader is like, "Yeah, it's over there." They're like, "Thanks." And the initiates continue their mysteries even as Dionysus collects their things on Zan. Zan's still carrying everything, and leave. So, a lot of things happening. Let's try and unpack a little bit. Keeping in mind again that there's probably a lot of references here that we've lost the context for. This could be inside jokes, references to food, dance, or even certain gods and goddesses. For example, and I've mentioned this a couple of times because Dionysus is for sure one of the gods that this cultural change is most apparent with. But, like, there's a reason why this Dionysus is okay to laugh at, while the Bacchus and the Bacchae from the tragedy is not. We are seeing a shift in the characterization of Dionysus. So, there's always possible that a shift like this has occurred as well with any of these gods or goddesses mentioned. So the mysteries, even now, are something of a mystery, simply because we don't have the connotations behind it. We don't have the context that we necessarily need to know exactly how far this is pushing performing it on stage, or whether or not we are literally making something up here and making fun of the idea of the mysteries. Because both of those are possible. It could be that this is really like a nail-biter, like, oh, Aristophanes has gotten, like, he's really pushing the limit there. He's pushing the envelope by presenting this. Or it could be literally we are on the floor laughing at the pretentiousness of something like this. And that's always going to be hard, because as much as we maybe don't always want to take the context in which a piece was written historically, that is something that you're going to have to keep in mind anyways. It doesn't have to be the only frame you view it through, but it's going to affect what is and is not acceptable. There are a lot of older works that use something like the N-word, or are very sexist towards women. With the context of the time they were written, that was perfectly fine. Now, that doesn't give it a get-out-of-jail-free card for those comments, but it places them in a time period that you can better understand how something like that got into the literature. And this is precisely something that even now we're dealing with and learning how to deal with properly. Because trying to take that stuff out, well, isn't that denying that those attitudes were ever held? Like, you can't use the N-word now, so remove it then. Well, then you're going to get to the point where people are just like, oh, no one ever used that word, actually. So you've got to keep it in the context, but you then can still judge it on both that context and the use of it. This is, yeah, welcome to the problem of dealing with a living art that most of it is actually very, very dead. Which is to say that literature doesn't just stay the same size and sort of bounce through history. Like, it keeps growing, right? And all this older stuff is from time periods, societies, cultures that have changed, making it in some way or another obsolete. But then it works in the other way as well. We keep reading things like Aristophanes' comedies because there's something we can still point to and say that's applicable even today. Even with this cultural, societal time shift, there's something in here that's applicable even today. This section, though, is one of the hardest ones to see that in, I find. Simply because it is so steeped in the culture of the time that finding pieces that you can understand outside of that cultural context is... you've got to think a little more broadly. You can't always find it in the details. You've got to think a little wider on this one. For example, one of the things that really spoke to me with the frogs, and trying to understand why the frogs were the the play title, is this strange recognition that Dionysus ends up taking on the Song of the Frogs as his own. And we could see this, we know when this happens, right? Yeah, because you've probably felt this on a personal level. When you've ever heard a piece of music which has just spoken to you at the right point in your life, at the right age, in the right genre, that it's just melded so completely with you that you've been like, that's my song. very seriously. Not like every song is your song. But just this one that's suddenly so perfectly forms who you are outside of yourself. Oh, okay, that's probably going to need some explaining. Reflection on yourself is very hard to do. In fact, again, as a personal thing, you probably noticed, not a lot of people are super self-aware. And that's because reflection on yourself is very hard to do. Just like it is impossible to see your entire body from your own perspective. Like, you can see a lot of it, but I can't see my own face right now. I can't see my back or my butt. And I really gotta shift to be able to see things like my feet. But using a tool like a mirror allows me to do that examination. I can stand in front of a mirror and I can see my face. And I can turn around and see my back over my shoulder and my butt. That's even true of things inside of us. We often have to externalize what we're feeling in order to examine it more closely. And this could be writing something, it could be reading something, it can be listening to something. And music, I find, is a universal language for people trying to find these moments. Literature can be, but if you're not into reading, it's not that easy. But there's more people not into reading than there are, I feel, people not into listening to music. It might take certain types of music that you're interested in listening to, but you can find a music you're interested in listening to. And that music, especially when you find that song that encapsulates what you're feeling in that moment, that's your way of self-examination. It is actually this exterior thing that is identifying this is what you're feeling, and you seeing this exterior thing and going, that's it. That's it. And suddenly understanding yourself better. Because oftentimes you can't put what you're feeling into words, and then somebody else does it and you're like... But what's happening here with Dionysus is actually a little uncomfortable, I find. Because we could simply read it as that externalization of an internal feeling. He recognizes himself in the frog song, so he can actually internalize that song then, because that's the next step, and take it on for himself. And that's what I mean, like, you see something that tells you this is how you're feeling, and you're like, yes, I understand that is what I'm trying. You then internalize that understanding. And you don't need to hear the song immediately, but when you get the feeling, you're just like, ah, and then you can describe it thanks to having heard the song help describe it before. That's that internalization that allows you to better understand yourself and externalize again, which is to continue speaking about what's happening inside. And we see this entire thing with Dionysus, which is to say, he is rowing along, the frogs start singing. Initially, Dionysus is not connecting fully with the songs. He keeps interrupting about how sore he is. But he keeps hearing the music, he makes a connection, he internalizes that connection, and then starts singing back to the frogs in their tune, complete with the breck-kecks and the cluck-clucks. So we're seeing that entire cycle of understanding oneself by externalization, internalization, then externalization. What's frightening, though, is the frogs then go silent. Have you figured out why that's frightening? I find that very uncomfortable. Which is to say that Dionysus, again, we have to see as the main character here, and as a god, he also is in a position of power. A position that doesn't become really apparent in the comedy, because we're constantly laughing at him, he's constantly making mistakes, he'll shit his pants later in the scene. But he is in the position of power, he is a god. And these are frogs who are dead. Like, if you look at what they say very closely, they say, "Let us sing as we sang long ago." Like, they're dead frogs. But that line, again, is coming in a critical place. So, Dionysus says, "Give over, my musical friends." And the frogs say, "What? Silence our chorus? Oh no, let us sing as we sang long ago. When we splashed in the sun, oh wasn't it fun, mid the weeds and the sedge at the pond's muddy edge. If it happened to rain, we'd dive under again to avoid getting soaked, still harder we croaked, till from under the slime our sub-aqueous rhyme bubbled out loud and clear for all men to hear, and burst with a plop at the top, plap, 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 and burst with a plop at the top." They ask Dionysus not to silence them. And he does anyways. And that's actually kind of a warning to us. It's basically the idea that we take something that we understand. Let's keep with the music. So you find a song that really understands you. It speaks to how you are feeling. And then you take that language and you internalize it. And you say, "Yes, okay." And then you never listen to that song again. It is useless now that you've internalized the feeling. And the idea with the frog chorus seems to be even broader than that. You find the song, you internalize it, you say, "Ah, yeah, I better understand myself now." And then no one will hear that song again. It speaks to the idea that the song was useful for you, but the thing you always have to keep in mind, and this is going to be the really uncomfortable thing about this cycle of understanding yourself, is recognizing that that piece of artwork does not exist purely for you alone. It can speak to you in really deep, important, gratifying ways, but it is not for you alone. So the idea that you can silence something like this because it speaks to you, like, that's the thing you really have to be careful about. You have to let the text or the song or the artist, if they're still living, continue to speak for themselves. That thing does not become your possession through your understanding of it. Which is, and plenty of people have written about this, this is going to be a really hard thing again for us to deal with, but that's why you have to be careful not to objectify something. You can understand it, you can have a conversation with it, but you cannot make the statement that that thing is now yours and yours alone, and yours to do with as you please. Which seems to actually be happening here with Dionysus. The frogs recognize that he's trying to take control, and they say, "No, let us continue existing as we have." And the play itself actually points this out. Because this is less likely to happen when you find something speaks to you fully. It's actually more likely to happen if you don't connect with it fully. If you actually look at the conversation that happens, so Dionysus says, give over, my musical friends. And And they say, no, let us keep singing. And he starts saying, but I fancy I'm about to take over for you. And they say, like, we'll be sunk if you do. I'll burst if I don't, so look out. And they end up having this back and forth. But then he says, now listen, you lyrical twerps, I don't give a damn for your burps. And then we suddenly have this realization that Dionysus, in this moment, isn't connecting with the music. He doesn't like it. He thinks that he can do better. And that the frogs should be silent. Now, the frogs have already stated that plenty of people have found connection with their music. They go through things like initiates tend to worship to the sound of our song and walk home to it. How Apollo comes to them for a new bridge to his lyre, how Pan needs the reeds for his pipes, and how the muses adore the frog song. And Dionysus silences them because he doesn't connect with that style of music. For Dionysus, it doesn't matter if other people love that music. He doesn't, so he wants to get rid of it and not listen to it anymore. And the frogs go quiet. And then suddenly you can see even clearer now the connection to the modern world. For example, the internalization-externalization is a very philosophical way of viewing the world. It's something you really have to think about and visualize in your head. But most of us recognize a history of concerned parents saying they don't want their kids listening to certain music. They don't want them reading certain books. This elevating to the point where politics says you can't read certain books, to the point where we're burning certain books. That's what's happening here. Dionysus doesn't connect fully with the frogs, so he's trying to censor them. Which is really, really uncomfortable, because Dionysus actually told Hercules off for this earlier. When Hercules was critiquing Dionysus' preference for tragedies and wanting to go and save Euripides, Dionysus basically says, I like what I like, you like what you like. But we suddenly see him here with the frogs telling them that he'll take over and they can be quiet because he'll do a better job. And I think that's why the play's named after him. It's a bit of a warning that the frogs should be allowed continue to sing, even if you don't always agree with what's being said. And this comes at a critical point in the play, of course, because the frogs are silenced right before the initiates come in. Well, how much trouble, again, is Aristophanes in for having these guys up on stage? Because it could be that he's actually letting out some secrets here that he shouldn't be. Or he could be making fun of the idea of these mysteries. And that's going to anger and piss some people off in a different way. Right? Anyone involved in a mystery, seeing it mocked or seeing it openly talked about on stage, that's going to be problematic either way. Well, who's going at Aristophanes going, you can't write this, you can't talk about this, you can't present this? Well, there's suddenly the Dionysus to Aristophanes' frogs. The frogs are the titular character because they're the ones that should be allowed to keep singing that we stop. And it's sad that we do. Because we actually lose something then if the frogs stop singing. Because we then lose the music of Apollo, the music of Pan, the music of the muses. What people fail to realize is as they start pulling something from the culture and saying this isn't allowed, other things start falling apart. It is a snowball effect. You can't read this one book. Well, now we have to dissect what happened in this one book that's not allowed, find that of every other book, and then not allow them. Well, sometimes those books are going to have critical messages. There are books that use the N-word precisely to critique its use. But to say if it has the N-word in it, we can't have that book out, is to lose those critiques. Just because you don't like the music doesn't mean you should take it away from everybody. Because people who are going to be so much more self-aware, thanks to that music, aren't going to get the chance to hear it. The frogs, while a shorter portion in this scene, are the key to understanding why then Aristophanes should be allowed to go on and critique the mysteries, to critique the audience, to critique even the gods. Now, this is a comedy, so it's going to be a little lighthearted. But when you really dig into it, the title of the play is important. It is the focus. And the focus is on the frogs. The little people whose song is silenced. That's a big social commentary right there. So I'm going to keep reading. We are heading on to Act 1, Scene 2 in the next video. And I hope you join me and keep reading with me. See you next time.